Alright, today we're going to cover pages 129 to 141, or the section comparing empires, the Roman and Chinese. We will hit in order: Rome from city-state to empire, China from warring states to empire, consolidating the Roman and Chinese empires, and the collapse of the empires. These empires are often compared, and it's very in vogue to compare the two of them. This has to do with the following comparisons. The first is that the Han and the Roman Empire roughly came about the same time period, or at least they flourished during the same time period, and that is 200 BCE through 200 CE. Next, they're roughly the same size, about 1.5 million square miles. The third is they have roughly the same population, about 50 to 60 million. And the fourth thing is not necessarily something that we use to compare them, but something you want to remember is they have limited interaction with each other. So they have limited interaction, about 200 to 200, time period 1.5 million square miles, 50 to 60 million inhabitants, and limited interaction with each other, unlike the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states who knew and interacted quite frequently. So those are the things we want to start off with. Also, I don't think I'm going to be writing like this anymore. I'll just use the text feature. The next thing we want to focus on is Rome from city-state to empire. When talking about the Roman Empire, it's traditional to talk about its foundings, its startings, where it came from. We want to know that at the time, this is the time of the Greeks and the Persians, it's kind of on the outskirts of what was known then as the civilized world. It's in the western part of the Mediterranean rather than the eastern part over here. And it starts out right here. It's a very small city-state that will eventually encompass this entire empire, not only huge in its size for its time, but also with a very enduring legacy, both in Europe and throughout other regions in the world. The city-state was ruled by kings, the last of which was known as Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, and he is cast off or rebelled against in a famous story, and they get rid of a king and they resort to a republic. Here are some things we want to remember about the republic. The first, wealthy patricians will make up the Senate. The executive power is in the hands of two consuls. So consuls are often referred to like the American president. However, there are two of them because the Romans distrust central authority so much because of their history with kings. The lower classes are known as plebeians. So those are the lower classes, as opposed to the wealthy upper classes known as patricians. Though not originally, the plebeians will get a form of representation in the government that is known as the tribune. He will represent the plebeians and work with the patricians and the consuls in order to run the government. The way that the Roman Republic worked was highly studied, and currently is highly studied, much more than other ancient empires, especially in America and in Western Europe. However, these are the things we want to remember from the reading and for the test. We also want to focus on some of the morals that make up the Roman Empire, namely the rule of law, honesty, hard work. These are core values that are practiced from the top to the bottom of the Roman Republic, written about, talked about, storied, that set them up and that they're proud of. So this is the foundation for the Republic. We go from our little city-state here to this huge empire. And it will take about 500 years. That has to do with the fact that they never really set out to build an empire. So how did they get there? Around 490 BCE, their little city-state starts to grow. And over the next couple hundred years, they will slowly take up a lot of the Italian peninsula, which will run them into one of their neighbors down here, Carthage. Between 264 and 146 BCE, they will fight a series of Punic Wars between their most famous adversary, this Carthaginian Empire. This is where you may have heard of Scipio Africanus or Hannibal. They are so incensed by the wars, which they will eventually win, that they After burning Carthage to the ground, they will actually famously salt the land around Carthage. And this is a famous Roman story. They salt all the land so nothing will grow there again. During the Punic Wars, they will get Spain and parts of the Western Mediterranean. And then, as they are expanding, they will move on to the Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient civilizations of Greece, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And they do this because they become much more powerful, including gaining sea power at this time. Now, they seem to kind of be all over the place, and in a sense they were. This was, again, not a planned empire. They saw their expansion as defensive in order to protect them and their allies from current and future attacks. And as this started in the small city-state, it continued to grow. Because every time you make a new friend or you grow into a new area, there are already people there, they're already existing, and they're already going to have new threats presenting. And so you need to create more land, more barriers. And if you're perpetually defensively building up, there's always somewhere new to defend. And you can see this by the way that the empire is built. See, up here, it's built across the rivers. Down here it has natural defenses, the North African and Arabian deserts. And where they don't have natural defenses like the water, or they keep the Mediterranean their sea, they will build their own defenses, like Hadrian's Wall up here. And so, although they do see the wealth of old civilizations, and they do plunder lands, and they have no problem taking over and colonizing areas that they feel are uncivilized, and getting wealth from this empire building, at the core, they are believing that it is a defensive growth. It was the Roman army that builds this empire, and rather than, say, Alexander the Great, who has a charismatic leader that leads everyone into battle and victory, the Romans have a longer, more institutionalized army. They do have great generals, and they will lose battles, but they are very tenacious, so they'll always come back. They're very methodical. They look at what they did well, they look at what they didn't do well, they fix the problems, they go back to battle again. They're well disciplined, they're in large numbers, they're well equipped, and through this, they're able to conquer all of this territory. And as they're conquering the territory, different people that are conquered will have different statuses. Some of them will get citizenship within the Roman Republic, some of them will get an ally status, some of them will keep the ally status. And with this huge empire and all these different people coming into it through conquest or through alliances, those values and the nature of the Roman Republic, the Roman Empire, will change. It's moving away from those old values of honesty and hard work, more into a warrior class, to where the upper class defines itself through its war, or its ability in war. It becomes very independent and very patriarchal. And even as that is happening, because of the size of the empire, upper-class women are gaining more rights. They're able to manage finances, take part in the growth of the empire, and they're growing at the same time. But because of this growth, and because of warrior class, there also becomes a huge population of slaves within the empire. The politics of the empire also change. By 27 BCE, Octavian, later known as Augustus, will take power, and this is often the time that historians will call this the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. But also coming with it is a time called the Pax Romana, and this is a time of the first couple centuries CE, a time of peace, of security, of growth, and of empire. The next thing we need to talk about is China, from warring states to empire. Well, let's start with the warring states. China had already established a precedent of empire building. We talked about the Jia, the Shang, the Zhao. This is not the first Chinese empire, like it was the first Roman Empire. But after the Zhao had kind of fallen apart, China faced a period called the Warring States. Now, the Warring States is probably most famous because it comes up with the philosophies, the political philosophies of Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism. which will later be influential throughout Chinese history. But it is a period of disunity in China. And the Qin leaders, the Qin state, especially a man named Qin Shi Huangdi, who will later be known as Qin Shi Huangdi, starts to take over this warring states. And he will unify all of them back together in one Chinese empire, or rather one Chinese state. The Zhao had called themselves kings. He calls himself the emperor. In fact, Shi Huangdi means the first emperor. And so he names himself the first emperor, creating this large Chinese state, which will subsequently grow under subsequent dynasties. So Qin Shi Huangdi does a lot of important things. The first is he does unify China again. So unifying it under one state. And unifying it not just politically, but he also unifies a system of weights and measures. He unifies a system of roads. And he unifies a system of languages. So those are the things he wants to remember. Remember, he unifies the state, weights and measures, roads, languages. He will also unify the making of coins and the way coins are produced. So circular bronze coins with this hole in the middle so that you can stack them on, say, like a string or a piece of leather and carry them around that way. Despite making these great consolidations and unifications for China, Qin Shi Huangdi is a ruler with an iron fist. And his province, the province of Qin, had adopted legalism. And Confucius scholars, Taoist scholars, most famously Confucius scholars, were actually burned. Books were burned. They were buried alive. The scholars were buried alive because, of course, they would keep the information in their head so you could write it down, or you would remember the information, and so he has the scholars buried alive and the books burned. So some good things and some bad things. Legalism and the Qin dynasty will not be popular after Qin Shi Huangdi's death. It probably wasn't even popular during his life, but he's such a strong monarch that rebellion is not allowed. His son, however, is a weaker monarch, and rebellions start to happen. The champion coming out of the rebellions is the Han dynasty, which will adopt Confucianism, mostly as its philosophy to dictate the policies of the subsequent empire. And it is the Han dynasty that is usually compared with the Romans. And you can see the Han dynasty is very large, moving in both into Vietnam and in Korea, expanding over here into Central Asia, forming the Silk Roads, and having troubles and interaction with the people surrounding it. The next thing we want to talk about is consolidating the Roman and Chinese empires. Let's make a list of some of the main similarities we want to focus on. So it's universality, infrastructure, divine authority, and foreign religious traditions. The first one is the universal terms. Given the size of the empires we talked about, 1.5 million square miles, 60 million inhabitants, for the time that they're living in, I mean, these are gigantic empires. And both of them consider that they are supreme. They're conquering the world. The Romans say they conquer almost the entire world. And of course, the Chinese, the Han at this time, or any Chinese dynasty, considers itself, or China, the Middle Kingdom, that they conquer all under heaven. The next we want to talk about is infrastructure. Okay, both of these build a lot of infrastructure in order to move their military around, in order to consolidate power, in order to communicate and move throughout the empire, facilitate trade. And the infrastructure and public works they build are canals, roads, bridges, aqueducts. They're building things, right? They're creating a way to get around, both for themselves and for the populace. The next one are the divine authority. Now, we've seen this a lot before. In order to get authority, we see supernatural sanctions. So, for example, in Rome, dead emperors start to become worshipped as gods. This is later on down the line in Rome. It kind of follows an older tradition called the Mandate of Heaven. Now, the Mandate of Heaven is basically this. Heaven is not known necessarily as a place you go when you die in this version of the word. It is basically known as a universal force that regulates and governs the universe. So in this use of the word, the Chinese understand that they must have a leader. that leader becomes the son of heaven, getting the mandate of heaven. And if that dynasty or that leader is a good leader, then it continues to keep the mandate of heaven. If things bad happen, so for example, a lot of floods, natural disasters, peasant rebellions, outside invasions, if these things happen, then a rival faction can claim that it is losing, or the dynasty is losing the mandate of heaven. And it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So say, for example, the Qin are there, and they say, we have the mandate of heaven because we are in charge. And the Han challenge them and say, you do not have the mandate of heaven. Well, a rebellion ensues. If the Qin win, then heaven has clearly shown that they get the divine right. They have the mandate of heaven. They've shown that they are chosen. If the Han win, then the Qin have lost their mandate. They no longer have the mandate of heaven. It's almost like the old concept of trial by combat, right? Two people fight. The winner wins because he was chosen to win. Same thing here with dynasties. But in both cases, we're looking at divine authority. We're looking at a supernatural sanction, right? Someone above just man is giving both governments the authority to rule. The last thing we want to talk about is the foreign religious traditions. In Rome, the foreign religious tradition will be Christianity. Now, technically it emerges within the peripheries of the Roman Empire, but again, in a diverse empire, it does not come from the heartland of the Roman Empire at all. It does spread, however, throughout the empire. It is aided throughout the Pax Romana and the rule of law of the Roman Empire, as well as the roads that travel throughout the Roman Empire. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, it does start to get state support, starting with Constantine, though not necessarily in a straight shot, but it will get state support by emperors, and then spread more rapidly. Buddhism, on the other hand, though it will be introduced into China during the Han Dynasty, will not gain state support during the Han Dynasty, and in fact it will be a very small contributor. It is later, after the collapse of the Han Dynasty, when Buddhism really starts to gain a foothold. And that's true as well for Christianity. Both of these religions will start to spread to greater numbers and with more rapidity after these dynasties or after these empires fall. Christianity will become the dominant religious force in Europe, and Buddhism will become one of the many religious or ideological traditions in China. But both of them start in this time period. One last thing that I would want to add, that's not necessarily in the reading, would be border barbarians. So both of these deal with barbarians, or groups that they considered barbaric, on their borders. And they had to deal with these groups. They often did so with military campaigns, interaction, and trade. But both groups of barbarians will be ever present in the growth of these empires. Let's move on to some of the characteristics that were maybe different in the two empires. Those would be conquered peoples, culture, language, government, and environment. As far as conquered peoples go, I know that the Romans had different alliances that they created, citizenship that they offered to some people, but for the most part, there was no cultural assimilation. They weren't trying to get everybody to come in. So the Greeks and the Egyptians and different groups may have become citizens, but they kept their own tradition. This was more of a legal status than necessarily a cultural status. Whereas the Chinese actively tried to get cultural assimilation to happen. They did this both through marriage and also through actively teaching their culture to conquered peoples. As far as that culture goes, in Rome, which is a piece-by-piece kind of conquering, without a cultural assimilation, we see a mixture of cultures, rather than one where a dominant Roman culture is exerting its influence on conquered peoples. Those conquered peoples, so for example the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, groups that have been there longer, were bringing their culture and their dominant culture into the Roman Empire, creating kind of a new thing. China, however, always being the dominant culture, this didn't happen. It exported its culture onto the conquered peoples. The next thing we have is language. So Chinese and Latin are different in just the construction of the language. Latin is based on a phonetic alphabet, whereas Chinese is based on characters. And the language itself of characters leads and promotes that Chinese assimilation, whereas the sounds of Latin will allow for many languages, Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, all of the subsequent French, the subsequent Romance languages to evolve from this, these Latin-based languages. And allows these separate cultural identities both to emerge and to flourish, both during and after the fall of the Roman Empire. The next is the government. The Han Dynasty will create a strong, centralized bureaucracy, as well as an examination system that will allow for the training and processing of these bureaucrats. Rome has much less of a bureaucracy, and it rules through military power, through alliances, and through a very established law code. So in the Roman culture, in the Roman tradition, it is good laws that make good government. In the Chinese tradition, it is good men that will make good government. The last thing we need to talk about is the environment. And this could be a commonality because both of them will change their environment substantially with the growth in industry that they produce, talking about that infrastructure, talking about the economic growth. They change their environment because of this. All right, the last thing we need to talk about is the collapse of the empires. Both of these empires will collapse. The traditional dates for the collapse are about 220 CE for the Han, 476 for Rome. Though these debates will be disputed and talked about, these are the dates we work with. It is important to note that though the Han dynasty will completely collapse, the Roman dynasty by this time, having gotten so large without an effective bureaucracy, had to split in earlier centuries. And because of this split, and in a series of administration and just luck, the Eastern Roman Empire becomes stronger and will persist. And after about 476, we call the Eastern Roman Empire, they called themselves the Romans, but we call them historically the Byzantine Empire, in order to distinguish them from the previous Roman Empire. And the Byzantine Empire will last and keep the Roman tradition, though changing it, for the next 1,000 years. So let's talk about some of the common factors. So the first one, which is commonly held, is that they just got too big, too expensive, right? They were overextended. You have to think this is pre-modern civilizations. These things are huge. They lasted this long with this much territory to cover is pretty impressive. And they just get too expensive. They have large professional armies. It just costs a lot to run them. And not only that, the large landowners start avoiding taxes, and both of them get to a point where they're too big just to run, too extended. And so one of the ways that they were fueling the growth was through conquest, was through gaining new territories and booty, and being able to give soldiers land, being able to move soldiers into places, give them treasure. And with that drying up, now they're just left with large armies that they have to pay. And they just get too big. Another one is governmental infighting. Both groups have people that want to get into power at the top, and they're fighting each other, creating an instability at the top. The American Congress is surely an example of that. And next would be diseases. Both of these large urban empires are prone to epidemics, and they hit. And the diseases will hurt the populations. The next thing we have are barbarian invasions. And we call these barbarian invasions. These are from nomadic or semi-nomadic peoples. For the Romans, it was the Germanic people on the other side of the Rhine. For the Chinese, it was the Xiongnu and other Central Asian nomadic peoples in Central Asia to the north. Now, the nomadic peoples to the north have been bothering China for most of its history. This is no exception. The Han Dynasty, however, with its policies of assimilation, will do a good job in dealing with, and in some cases assimilating, the threat. However, the threat is there and will contribute to the weakening of the empire. The collapse is much more final in the Roman Empire, in the Western Roman Empire. Remember, the Romans had they had split, and secondarily, they didn't assimilate quite a bit. And so the barbarians are coming over, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes they're just moving in. They're getting pushed by the Huns from Central Asia, who are also coming in. And with the weakness of the Roman Empire and the way that it was set up, once somebody gets through, they're through. And the Germanic tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Visigoths, the Saxons, all these different groups, will combine their Germanic tribes with the Latin culture and create a new culture in Europe. And this will be one of the differences that we will have to talk about, is that the Roman Empire never comes about again. Now, the idea of the Roman Empire will stay strong in Europe, and though the Eastern Roman Empire will stick around, something this large, unifying Western Europe, unifying the area, will not happen again. In China, however, after another couple hundred years of disunity, it will unify again. Under the Shui, and under the Tang, and under the Song, we will see a single emperor, we will see a bureaucracy under the same system, the mandate of heaven, the emperor considering him the son of heaven, the increase of Buddhism, of Confucius thought. And this will continue in China. In Europe, we will never see this again, this unified of a state, until we'll see what happens with the European Union, but up until that point, we've never seen anything. And so again, on the one hand, the Roman Empire collapses, with the Eastern Roman Empire staying around, the empire never to be being rebuilt again, whereas China, we will see the empire rebuild again and again, and this is the end of our chapter, or section, rather.